heard so far from everyone? Yeah, you still going to stick with reform, going to vote for us, going to stand for us? You're convinced? Come on. Right, thank you. Well, you know, in the process of preparing this speech, I was actually wondering how much of it I was going to need to change by the time I delivered it. Will another MP have resigned because of death threats? What's the latest that's happened in this week's pro-Palestine march? What level of escalation have the extremists gotten away with now? Will another genocidal slogan be beamed on the side of one of our great buildings? Maybe the Islamic State flag on Buckingham Palace? But, you know, I realized, whatever the latest manifestation of an emboldened anti-Western fifth column, this has been decades in the making. Not only have successive governments presided over totally indiscriminate and nation-changing levels of immigration, whereas many people came to Britain in 2022 in 1 year alone, as they had come over a total of 36 years leading up to the turn of the century. But any efforts to unite this new Britain under a shared culture have been actively silenced or willfully smashed up. Our own history is vilified. Our flag is mocked. Our national values are made to be inferior to practices and religions whose mores are in direct conflict with our own, while painting all newcomers as stainless, blameless victims of oppression, when frankly we're the ones suffering cultural vandalism. You know, let me tell you something, as a woman. Across the whole of Europe, in big cities, women are now being subjected to the sort of aggressive harassment that have once upon a time been totally unconscionable. In some parts of this country, this has become so severe, it's actually spilled over into industrial grooming, drugging, and raping of young children by entire gangs of men. But whatever you do, don't offend anyone by pointing out who the perpetrators are. Shh. Terror attacks, hate preaching, ideological murders, baying mobs, they're not the casual phenomena of any society. They're the results of a very dangerous subculture that is deliberately not being addressed. And things are getting worse. What sort of Britain do we live in when a school teacher is still in hiding as a result of an extremist mob who contested his RE lesson? When an autistic kid who scuffed a Quran faced threats? When a primary school had to close its doors after extremists threatened to bomb it because that school wanted to ban their little kids from wearing political badges? Doesn't stop there though, does it? When a justice minister has been forced to step down because his office was set ablaze on Christmas Eve and has been receiving death threats because he supports Israel and is gay. You know, MPs are waking up to chanting crowds, body bags, and burning effigies. Was not the murder of a politician at the hands of a fanatic a seminal moment, a pause for thought? Well, apparently not. We were just told to be kinder to each other online. You know, 2 days ago, the Labour Party were apparently having a chit-chat with the Speaker, saying, if you don't let us have our amendment on a ceasefire in Gaza, then our MPs are going to be receiving death threats. They're going to be very, very afraid. Wind the clock forwards, and today the Labour Party's going, there's no such, it's all Islamophobia, it's the work of the far right. Can't have it both ways. What we have seen over recent weeks is the ghoulish return of sectarian politics into our democracy. balkanized and divided religious voting blocs which threaten democracy altogether. You know, when politics stops focusing on what is the best for the greatest number, and instead it seeks to appease a minority, when it rejects objective policy making and instead kowtows to subjective identitarian bias, we become dangerously divided. Through vain and venal virtue signaling and the luxury ideology of being tolerant, those in power have actually laid down a red carpet for intolerance, a Labour-coloured red carpet. You know, back in 2019, there was an organisation set up calling for a Muslim vote. This organisation is allegedly associated with someone who was once part of the now proscribed Hizb ut-Tahrir group. And this organisation now plans to focus on unseating MPs in constituencies with large Muslim populations, especially if they didn't back an immediate ceasefire. The Muslim Council of Britain found in 2019 that 31 marginal seats could be decided by Muslim votes, potentially enough to swing an actual election. The Muslim Vote website itself declares that with 4 million of us acting in unison, we wield significant influence. It's not a bad thing that, you know, Muslims can have influence in elections and vote like the rest of us, but what we shouldn't have is this idea that you have religious voting blocs. It's not just confined to one religion either. There's going to be forthcoming reports out soon that's going to expose similar voter manipulation and intimidation with a particular Sikh organisation. Again, with suspected connections to globally banned groups. They also say they're strategizing their vote alongside other minorities to become a political force that parties cannot ignore. Look, there shouldn't be a need for a Muslim vote, a Hindu vote, a Christian vote, an atheist vote, in a society that prides itself on being integrated. Tribal voting stands in the way of cohesive national progress. But it's not just about the voting. You know, there are other innocuous-sounding Muslim organizations reported to have direct ties with terrorist organizations that have been banned in Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, as well as having links to our good friends Hamas. The imam at the mosque where Lee Rigby's killers worshipped, who lost a court case against Andrew Neil, he said he wasn't an extremist, Andrew Neil said he was. Well, guess who was right? Andrew Neil. He's proudly, today online, bragging how he has converted 30,000 Brits to Islam. Their end goals are not of integration. The same organizations are behind these weekly mass mobilizations on our streets. Don't take it from me. The head of the Commission for Countering Extremism, a chap called Robin Silcox, he warned that thousands of protesters don't appear out of nowhere. They're part of a sophisticated Hamas and Iranian-backed network that, in his words, has the capacity to not only carry out or incite acts of violence on Britain's streets, but spread extremist views through regime-linked clerics, charities, and so-called educational institutes. Some of these groups are even training the police in how to counter Islamophobia. Perhaps that's why the police have stood by and done nothing when terrorist chants are heard on our streets, or when racist slogans are projected on Parliament. So afraid are our public organisations of disrupting community relations that our sense of community is being torn apart. hideously, the bourgeois left are now siding with radical Islamists. They find themselves blind to the intimidation. They agree with banning books, silencing voices, and normalizing anti-Semitism. And they believe they're on the right side of history and call those trying to stand up against such fascism the Nazis. It's not just perverse, this is perilous. You know, if at one point, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I had said, I think the tail might be wagging the dog, I would have been accused of being a dog whistle. Probably still will, let's be fair. But that is exactly what we are seeing today. Our government is providing zero buffer or protection to our institutions. Our politicians are inert. I mean, what has Sunak said or Starmer said after this so-called threat, this big threat to politicians that made us dump hundreds of years of political protocol and parliamentary convention? They're not talking to us. Our schools have been hijacked, as well as our university campuses, and turned into ideological battlegrounds. You kind of expect it at universities, but primary schools, high schools, leave our kids alone. And for what I've seen over the last few months of these weekend marches, these jolly peace strolls that everyone seems to be saying are not harmful at all, seems to me the police are defending those from whom we expect to be defended. There's that old adage, isn't there, that the path to hell is paved with good intentions. And I actually believe most people don't want to offend, nor do they want to marginalize communities, and they definitely don't want to find innocent people caught in the crossfire of a fracturing national consensus. I'm one of those. I've got no issue with anybody of any colour or creed at all. I've lived in so many different countries I can barely list them, and I don't see colour, and I don't see race, and I don't see religion. But I do want to see unity. And by sweeping massive issues under the carpet, we no longer have firm ground to stand on. Join me, would you, in imagining what our politics might look like in a decade's time if we allow imported ideologies of small yet highly coordinated groups to gain footholds in our democratic process. Exactly. My point exactly. But if they realize they can win through intimidation with impunity, then this cancer will grow, and there'll be an entire tumor we'll have to excise lest our body politic dies. Another adage for you. For evil to flourish, it only requires that good men do nothing. Yet that is what is happening. Our leaders have said nothing about the scourge of sectarianism that they have allowed to be ushered in. Like I said, we're not a racist country. Where were the protests about having an Indian Hindu Prime Minister, a black Home Secretary, a Buddhist predecessor to him, the brilliant Ben Habib being our deputy leader? These protests never happened, and they never will happen, because we're not a country that sees colour. But we're constantly being told we have to regard everything through this divisive lens. And in doing so, we need to abide by the neo-religion of political correctness. Our institutions go to great lengths to attack Britain and its history, to self-cannibalise by trying to apportion blame equally for things that are happening, even if that means being blind to reality. You know, the independent reviewer of the government's Prevent strategy to combat extremism has warned that the government is failing to take tough enough action against Islamist extremism because of this continuing internal bias towards trying to identify the rise in right-wing terrorism. The truth is, the two are inextricably linked. They are the product of not combating this growth in social balkanization. By doing nothing, not only do we face the threat of emboldened extremism, but reciprocal radicalization. Talking about defending British culture is not just taboo these days, it's often derided as some kind of hate speech. But it's real hate speech that seems to be getting the last word. The tyranny of silence, which has left a vacuum, has ushered in some of the darkest forces that we've ever seen, enabled by a dangerous cocktail of cowardice, vanity, and ignorance. We don't actually have a democracy when our country is unwilling to stand up for its own values, to placate those that want to destroy them. If we don't unite against intimidation, it will only encourage more of the same. I'm afraid we no longer have the luxury of pretending that we don't have a problem. Left-wing political parties, for too long, have worried about getting the maximum number of votes no matter the cost. They have allowed what we should be fighting against to become part of the political discourse. You know that Azhar Ali, standing in Rochdale, Simon does, you know when he turned round and made those horrific comments about saying that the 7th of October attacks were staged so Israel could go and punish Gaza? And then, of course, he said, I'm so sorry, I didn't know what I was talking about. And Sir Keir Starmer said he's sorry, it's all right. And then pressure made Sir Keir Starmer realise this probably wasn't a good look, and so they let him go. Well, Mr. Ali has since turned around and said, I meant it all along, I wasn't sorry at all. Of course he wasn't. Conference. Soon we're going to arrive at a time where we're going to be forced to take the sort of action that we, as a free and liberal society, should definitely not want to take. We should find it utterly unconscionable. We shouldn't have to stem the freedom of speech, nor the right to protest. We should not have to monitor what goes on inside places of worship. We should not have to demand that religious organizations declare their financial sources. We should not have to say you cannot wear what you like or live as you'd want. We should not be pushed to the point of having to tell anybody in our country that the lifestyle they wish to lead is unacceptable. But if we don't deal with what's going on, then frankly, soon we'll have little choice left. And that's because we have imported cultural mores in direct conflict with our own. It is important to point out, I'm not just saying this to tick a politically correct box, it is important to point out we are still talking about a small minority. But if that small minority is allowed to grow, and the bigger and the bolder that small minority gets, the more the majority will suffer. And so it is that more and more people are finally waking up to the realization that what we need is actual change. But unless each and every one of us who believes in defending decency and democracy, who believes in defending our values, who believes in diplomacy, but with discipline, those of us who want to protect what we as a society have had that's enabled us to prosper as part of one shared culture, the only change that will come will be a change for the worse. I don't care about being called a racist when I know it's racism I'm fighting. I don't care about being mislabeled as a fascist when it's fascism I'm calling out. And it's utterly nonsensical to label this as some kind of phobia when it's a very rational concern borne out by increasing incidents of extremism and hate. So is there light at the end of the tunnel? Sometimes it feels like it's just getting further away. But one thing has reassured me a little bit. In recent months, people are now finally feeling that they can speak about their palpable concerns. And perhaps that's because the situation has become so fraught, it is impossible to deny now. But sunlight is the greatest disinfectant. And what we have seen growing over these past few months is ugliness in the clear light of day. Those who want to destroy us from within must not be allowed to cloak themselves in the false shroud of victimhood. Those who want to fight intolerance must no longer be afraid to speak out at the risk that they themselves are going to be called intolerant. The words that we need to talk about things openly and pragmatically and honestly, the things we must not be forced to accept, those words must not be taken away from us. By gagging and demeaning and weakening and forsaking our own culture, all we do is allow more potent and dangerous cultures to dominate. I will say it again. Britishness is not defined by skin colour, nor by class, nor by being on the left, nor the right. We are a pretty ancient nation. We've lived through centuries of invasion, our own religious wars, Protestants versus Catholics. It wasn't long ago that we were still seeing troubles in Northern Ireland. We've learned to become a place in which those who share common values can call it home. But today, we've arrived at a fractured, fractious, febrile atmosphere, not because we've been sleepwalking into it, as Miss Braverman seems to think has happened. That can't be the case, can it? When people have been deliberately gagged, when whistleblowers have been demonized, it's not sleepwalking. That's being willfully driven at high speed by people drunk on their own misplaced vanity and superiority. Alongside the spinelessness of many more who dare not say anything or make the first move. Well, let's make sure this ends today. The silence of our political leaders is deafening, but we won't be silenced. Because this year, our voices will be heard at the ballot box. And our shared way forward is going to be with one pledge, that we are allowed to defend our history. We can defend our principles, and we must demand that people uphold our laws. And you know and I know that only one party is going to promise you that. It's time for reform. And I'm going to end by saying this. If it is moral and right and wonderful to celebrate and protect the cultures of others, to give freedoms to everybody no matter where they're from, then we too have every right to enjoy the same protections and the same freedoms.